The sky had that washed-out winter color that makes everything look a little tired. Even the bright holiday lights strung along the freeway. I was driving back toward Tacoma after wrapping up a dull little insurance case in Bellevue, one of those long days where the most exciting thing you see is a guy switching price tags in a discount store. The heater in my old sedan rattled faintly. The radio hummed low in the background, and the traffic moved in that slow, steady crawl that lets your mind wander, places you are not always ready to go. If you are listening to this right now, I am curious what you are doing. Are you folding laundry? Sitting in your favorite chair with a cup of tea? Knitting? Maybe lying in bed with the lights off? For me, when everything in my life shifted in a single breath, I was sitting alone behind the wheel of that car, inching through a crowded parking lot just off the freeway, tired and hungry, and thinking mostly about what kind of soup I had in my pantry. I had turned off the main road to cut through a shopping center I knew well. It was one of those polished suburban places, all glass storefronts and little trees wrapped in white lights, the kind of place where people in nice coats carry matching shopping bags and stop for lattes they do not really need. I was easing past the entrance to a department store, waiting for a couple with a stroller to cross, when I saw Ethan. It took a second for my brain to register his face. There is that odd moment sometimes when you see someone you know in the wrong place, and your mind tries to file them under a stranger. But then he laughed, that big, charming laugh he used in every one of my sister's social media posts, and my stomach dropped. He was not alone. A woman stood close beside him near the row of cars, her head tilted back as she smiled up at him. She was pretty in that effortless way, long, honey-colored hair spilling over the collar of her camel coat, one hand resting lightly on his chest. He leaned down as she said something, their bodies angled toward each other, the space between them far too intimate for an innocent shopping trip. I slowed the car almost to a stop without even thinking. Behind me, someone tapped their horn, impatient. I barely heard it. The woman reached up and straightened Ethan's scarf with a little familiar flick of her fingers. He put his hand at the small of her back, guiding her toward a sleek black car I did not recognize as Caroline's, moving like he had done it 100 times. My work life has trained my eyes in a way I do not always appreciate. I notice distances, angles, the way people position their bodies when they think no one is watching. I have spent years sitting in cars and on benches, watching marriages crumble in the space of a handshake. So I did not need anyone to explain to me what I was seeing. This was not a business meeting. This was not a cousin or an old friend. This was a man who was supposed to be engaged to my sister, acting like he was already taken by someone else. My hand moved automatically toward my camera on the passenger seat. If I could get a clear shot, if I could freeze this moment in pixels, maybe it would not be my word against his charming denials when the time came. I picked it up, thumb finding the power switch, lifted it just enough to frame them through the windshield. The car behind me laid on the horn this time, long and loud. I flinched, heart jumping. The last thing I needed was some irritated stranger climbing out to yell, drawing attention to me with a camera pointed at a couple in a parking lot. Ethan and the woman were already moving, slipping between two parked SUVs and out of my line of sight. I had a split second to choose between stopping in the middle of the lane for the shot or moving on. Years of not wanting to make a scene, won. I dropped the camera onto the seat, muttered something I will not repeat here, and rolled forward, letting the car behind me roar past with a gesture I pretended not to see. I circled the lot once more, hoping I might catch a glimpse of them again near the doors, near another exit, anywhere. Nothing. It was as if the ground had opened up and swallowed them. By the time I gave up and turned back toward the road, my heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, knuckles white, the cheerful holiday music drifting out of the storefronts, feeling suddenly cruel. Part of me wanted desperately to pretend I had not seen what I just saw. It would be so much easier to go home, heat up that soup, turn on some mindless show, and let the whole thing fade into that gray area of things you almost saw. But another part of me, the part that is sat across from too many women wishing someone had told them sooner, knew I could not do that. Caroline might be a lot of things, but she was still my sister. I pulled into an empty space at the far edge of the lot, put the car in park, and just sat there for a minute, breathing. The air inside the car felt thick. I turned the heater down, cracked the window an inch, and reached for my phone. Her name was near the top of my recent calls, right under Dad. I stared at it for a long second. We were not close the way sisters in movies are close. There were no late-night heart-to-hearts, no borrowing of sweaters, no casual dropping by for coffee. Our relationship had always felt like standing in her shadow, watching her glow with all the approval I never quite earned. But even with all that, I could not imagine knowing what I knew and saying nothing. I tapped her name. The line rang once, twice. On the third ring, she picked up, her voice brisk and bright. The way she talked when she was in the middle of something important. I could hear voices in the background, the murmur of an office, the clink of glass. I said her name and that I needed to tell her something, and that she should probably sit down if she could. That was as far as I got before her tone sharpened. She said she was in a meeting, and this had better be good. I swallowed and told her, as plainly as I knew how, that I had just seen Ethan in the parking lot of the Bellevue shops with another woman. That they were standing very close, that his hands and his eyes and his body language were not brotherly or professional. There was a stretch of silence so complete I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. Then she laughed. It was not her happy laugh, more like the brittle edge of glass snapping. She asked if I had been sitting in my car spying on people again, like it was some cheap joke. I reminded her that, yes, that is literally my job, but that had nothing to do with this. I told her I did not want to hurt her. I just could not ignore what I saw. Her voice went cold. She asked if I had any proof, any photos, any video. I said no, that the angle had been bad, that I had tried but could not safely get the shot without causing a scene. I said I knew that was not what she wanted to hear, but it did not change what happened. She sighed into the phone, the sound full of impatience. She told me I had always had a suspicious mind, and that maybe I should. Remember, I did not know what a healthy relationship looked like before I started judging hers. The words stung more than I wanted to admit. I tried again. I said I was calling her sister, not as a private investigator. I said that if I ever saw a man act like that with me, I would want someone to warn me, even if it turned out to be a misunderstanding. I said she deserved to know enough to at least ask him about it. She cut me off. She told me she and Ethan were fine, that he was busy courting investors and clients for their next big project, that he met with lots of people. She said my problem was that I could not stand to see her succeed with someone when I was still alone. She called me jealous, that old ugly word that clung to my ribs like smoke. Then she told me, very clearly, to keep my paranoia out of her life and out of Clark & Company. I could almost see the way she would be tossing her hair back as she said it, dismissing me with the same flick of the wrist she used to dismiss a design. Sample she did not like. Before I could decide if it was worth saying anything else, the line went dead. I sat there in the silence that followed, phone still pressed to my ear even though the call had ended, watching the fog of my breath on the inside of the windshield. The cheerful shoppers moved past, bundled in coats, laughing, arms full of gifts. Inside my car, it felt like another planet. I lowered the phone into my lap slowly. Somewhere deep in my chest, something cracked. A hairline fracture, like the first line that appears in a pane of glass before. The whole thing spiderwebs. I told myself she was upset and under pressure, and that I should give her time. I told myself that maybe she would calm down, maybe she would think about what I said, maybe she would quietly ask Ethan some hard questions. I wanted to believe that. I really did. I started the engine again and pulled out of the lot, heading toward the freeway, toward home, toward the tiny apartment where I kept my files and my coffee and the parts of myself that never quite fit inside my parents' house. I was halfway between the exit and the on-ramp when my phone lit up again on the console. This time, it was my dad. I hesitated, then tapped to answer, not knowing that by the time that call ended, I would no longer have a place at his Christmas table. His voice hit my ear before I even had a chance to say hello. It was sharp in that way he used when he had already made up his mind about something, and was only calling to deliver the verdict. I could hear office sounds behind him, the hum of computers, a printer running, someone closing a desk drawer. He must have been at work, which meant he was calling in the middle of his day, something he rarely did unless it concerned the company or Caroline. He said my name the way you might say the name of a student who had disappointed you. I answered softly, bracing myself. He asked what exactly I had told my sister. I repeated the truth as calmly as I could. I told him I had seen Ethan in the parking lot with a woman I did not recognize. I told him they looked intimate. I told him I had tried to take a picture but could not capture it. There was no pause to consider my words, no moment of quiet where a parent thinks about his child's tone or fear. He snapped that I had no business meddling in Caroline's life. He said Ethan had been meeting with people nonstop for their expansion plans, and that I had no right to assume anything. He asked if I was trying to embarrass the family. I felt my throat tighten. I tried to tell him that I had called because I cared, that I had nothing to gain from making something like this up. He cut me off again, said he knew exactly what was happening. He said I was jealous. That word again. It hit me with a dull, familiar thud. He asked me point blank if I had any proof. I told him I could not get the photo in time. He let out a frustrated breath that crackled in my ear. He said without proof, I had no right to stir up trouble. I told him I was not stirring anything. I had simply warned her. He lowered his voice then, the way he did when he wanted to sound controlled and firm and final. He said Caroline had called him in tears, that she told him I was trying to ruin her engagement, that I had always struggled with her success, that I had crossed a line this time. I wanted to scream that she had twisted everything, that I was not trying to ruin anything, that I would never want to hurt her. But he kept talking, and every word felt like a door closing. He said if I did not apologize to her by the end of the week, I would not be welcome at the family Christmas dinner. He said this year was important because they were hosting investors and partners at a holiday reception after the meal, and he would not tolerate me creating drama or making Caroline uncomfortable. I gripped the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. I felt heat rise behind my eyes. I told him I had nothing to apologize for. He said then maybe it was best if I stayed home this Christmas. The call ended with a click that felt like a slap. I drove the rest of the way back to my apartment in Tacoma in a kind of fog. The heater blew warm air across my face, but I felt cold all the way down my arms. When I reached my building, I parked and sat in the silence, the engine ticking as it cooled. My phone lay in my lap, silent and heavy. Upstairs, in my small living room with the soft lamp in the corner, I sank onto the couch and stared at the blank wall for a long time. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, tried to make sense of the way everything had flipped on me in less than an hour. I replayed the parking lot in my mind, the way Ethan had touched that woman's back, the way they had leaned into each other. I replayed Caroline's voice calling me jealous, Dad's voice telling me to apologize or stay away. Eventually, I got up and opened my laptop. I typed Ethan's full name into the search bar. His face came up immediately, smiling in dozens of professional headshots. There he was at networking events, shaking hands with business owners. There he was in photos beside Caroline, looking like the perfect partner in every way. His LinkedIn profile listed titles that looked impressive at first glance. But when I clicked deeper, something felt off. Several companies he claimed to have consulted for had no online presence at all. One address linked to an abandoned building. His last listed employer had a website that looked slapped together in an afternoon with stock photos and broken links. I dug deeper, scanning public filings, conference attendee lists, and industry directories. His name appeared in some places, then disappeared without consistency. 2 colleagues he listed as references did not have LinkedIn accounts. His stated credentials sounded vague. I saw enough inconsistencies that the pit in my stomach tightened into something sharp. This was not just a man flirting with another woman behind my sister's back. This was someone whose entire professional identity seemed to be stitched together with loose threads. Part of me wanted to call Caroline back and show her everything I had found, but I knew she would not answer. Even if she did, she was too angry to hear me. I saved screenshots anyway. A habit from years of investigative work. Rows of open tabs glowed on my screen like warning lights. The next morning, I woke up with my jaw clenched and a weight on my chest. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before reaching for my phone. I typed a long message to Caroline. Careful, respectful, straightforward. I said I cared about her, and that what I had seen concerned me deeply. I attached the links that looked suspicious. I said I was not trying to control anything. I was not trying to judge her. I was simply scared that something was off. I waited. The bubble showed she was typing, then disappeared. A minute later, a short message arrived. She said she was disappointed in me, that I was meddling in things I did not understand, that she trusted Ethan, and I needed to stay in my lane. My hands shook a little as I set the phone down. I felt like someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed. A few hours later, another message appeared, this time from Dad. It was colder than the call had been. He said he understood now why Caroline was upset. He said he did not want drama in the family. He said again that I needed to apologize for creating a scene, or else Christmas was off the table for me. I sat on the edge of my bed, reading the words over and over, feeling numb. Mom stayed silent through all of this. She texted once with a vague message about hoping everyone could calm down, but she did not choose a side, which somehow felt worse. By late afternoon, I knew I could not breathe in that apartment anymore. Every room felt too small. Every memory of holidays past felt heavy and tight around my ribs. I pulled out my suitcase from the closet and dropped it on the bed. I packed a few linen shirts, jeans, my camera, my laptop, and the notebook I kept for my cases. I moved on instinct, the decision forming in my mind faster than my doubts could interrupt. I opened my phone and booked a one-way ticket to Maui. The next flight was early the following morning. I would work from there. Nora could run surveillance on the local cases. I needed distance from Washington, from the company, from the voices that never believed me. As the sun set outside my window, painting the buildings in dusty orange, I zipped my suitcase and sat on the bed. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. I looked around at the space that had held me together through long nights and hard cases, and for the first time it felt more like a cage than a home. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come, wondering if by leaving, I was finally choosing myself for the first time in years. When the alarm rang before dawn, I got up, grabbed my suitcase, locked the door behind me, and stepped out into the cold, dark morning, unaware that while I flew across the Pacific trying to catch my breath, a storm was already building back in Seattle, with my name caught right in the middle of it. The airport in Seattle was still half asleep when I rolled my suitcase across the cold tile. But my mind was wide awake and humming. The overhead lights were too bright, the coffee line too long, and every family gathered at the gates looked like a reminder of what I was walking away from. I moved through security on autopilot, took off my shoes, put my laptop in the tray, and answered the agent when they asked how my day was in that automatic, polite way we all do. My body went through the motions. My heart felt like it was somewhere else entirely. On the plane, I took a window seat and tucked my coat into the overhead bin. A man in a blazer sat down beside me, already scrolling through his phone, his face lit by emails and spreadsheets. I buckled my seatbelt and looked out at the runway, at the wet gray tarmac, and the outlines of mountains in the distance. The cabin filled with the soft sounds of people settling, zippers closing, babies fussing, the plasticky crackle of safety cards. When the plane finally lifted off, my stomach dipped, and for a second, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Just the aircraft, but my entire life. I watched as the dark water of the Sound spread out beneath us, the little clusters of lights along the coastline shrinking until they blurred into one. Seattle disappeared into the clouds. Hours later, the world outside my window traded gray for blue. The clouds broke apart, and there it was. The water a deep, shining turquoise beneath us, the shape of Maui rising up out of it like something from another life. The coastline curved, waves tracing white lines along the shore. I pressed my forehead lightly against the cool window and felt a strange mix of grief and hope rise in my chest. Stepping off the plane in Kahului felt like walking into another planet. Warm air wrapped around me, heavy with moisture, and the faint sweetness of flowers. Palm trees swayed beyond the low walls of the open-air terminal. People moved a little slower, laughed a little easier. I could feel my shoulders drop an inch without my permission. I picked up my suitcase at the carousel and followed the signs to the rental car counters. The clerk smiled with an ease I was not used to. He asked how long I was staying. I said I was not sure yet. He nodded like that made perfect sense and handed me the keys to a small, compact car that smelled of sunscreen and something citrus. Driving toward Kihei, the road curving past sugarcane fields and glimpses of the ocean, I felt my breathing settle into a rhythm that matched the swaying of the tall grass outside. I rolled the window down just enough to let in the breeze. It carried the sound of birds, and faintly, the crash of waves in the distance. The studio I had rented was in a modest building a few streets back from the water. White walls, terracotta roof, a small parking space out front. Inside, the place was simple. A bed pushed against the wall, a little table with 2 chairs, a kitchenette with a tiny stove, and a sliding glass door that led out to a narrow balcony. Beyond the railing, I could see the tops of other buildings and, beyond them, a strip of glittering blue. I set my suitcase down, took a deep breath, and let the quiet sink in. No ticking clock from my parents' living room, no murmur of my dad's voice carrying down the hallway as he talked on the phone about contracts and clients. No weight of Caroline's success hanging in the air, just my own footsteps and the soft buzz of the ceiling fan overhead. I unpacked slowly, folding my clothes into the small dresser, lining up my camera lenses on the shelf. I set my laptop on the table, plugged in the charger, and placed my notebook beside it. Each small action felt like staking a claim on a new piece of ground. When I finally sat down, the room felt less like a temporary stop and more like a place I might actually rest. The first call I made from that little table was to Nora. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with that mix of concern and practicality I had come to depend on. She asked if I had landed and if the place was decent. I told her about the palm tree outside and the way the air smelled, and for a moment, we both just breathed together. Then she switched to business because that is who she is and who I had trained myself to be. We went over our active cases. A messy custody situation in Olympia, a suspected employee theft in a small manufacturing firm outside Portland, a woman in Spokane who thought her ex-husband might be stalking her again. All of them could be handled remotely for a while, with Nora on the ground and me behind the laptop. Talking about work steadied me. In that world, my instincts were trusted. My eyes were valued. No one called me jealous there. When we hung up, I checked my email. A few clients, a reminder from my landlord back in Tacoma, a newsletter I never remembered subscribing to. Nothing from my family. Of course not. They had made their position clear before I ever got on the plane. For the rest of the afternoon, I let myself drift. I walked down to the beach, the sand warm under my bare feet. The waves rolled in and out, steady and sure, like they had been doing long before any of my family drama existed and would continue long after. Children played at the shoreline, their shrieks of laughter carried on the wind. Older couples walked slowly along the water's edge, shoulders brushing, feet sinking into the wet sand with each step. I sat on a flat rock and watched the horizon. The sun slipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink I could never find words for. For a little while, I did not think about Ethan or Caroline or Dad. I just breathed. As the light faded and the air cooled, I walked back to the studio. I made a simple dinner on the tiny stove. Pasta with jarred sauce and a few vegetables from the market down the street. I ate at the table with the balcony door open, listening to night sounds I did not recognize yet. Crickets. Distant music, a car passing slowly. Later, lying in bed in the dark, the ceiling fan whirring softly overhead, my mind finally dared to move backward. I thought about being 10 years old, watching Caroline at a school play while Mom and Dad sat in the front row, faces lit with pride. I thought about the way Dad introduced her at company parties, calling her the future of Clark and Company. I thought about how, when neighbors asked about his children, his eyes always brightened at her name first. I thought about the day I told them I wanted to become a private investigator. Mom had blinked, confused. David had laughed a little, asked if I was serious, then said something about wasting a good brain on other people's bad decisions. Caroline had smirked, saying it sounded like something out of a low-budget television show. They had not meant to be cruel. They rarely did. But the message had been clear. Your life is smaller. Your choices are less worthy. Your path is something we do not understand, so we will not respect it. Those old scenes replayed in my mind now with a new sharpness. I realized how many times over the years I had swallowed hurt rather than risk their disapproval. How many times I had stayed quiet during dinners when conversations circled around Caroline's latest campaign or Dad's newest contract. How often I had changed the subject away from my own work, even when I had helped someone escape something dangerous. Now here I was, thousands of miles away, because when I finally spoke up about something that mattered deeply, they chose once again not to see me. Sometime after midnight, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, light poured in around the edges of the curtains. I made coffee and carried my mug to the balcony, letting the steam curl up into the warm air. My phone sat on the table inside, where I had dropped it the night before. Face down, silent. It was not until mid-morning that I picked it up. For a second, I considered not turning it on at all, keeping that clean, blank silence a little longer. But curiosity tugged at me, along with something that still, stubbornly, wanted to know if anyone had tried to reach me. I pressed the button. The screen lit up, and the notifications flooded in like a wave. Missed calls, text messages, voicemails. The numbers climbed as the phone reconnected fully. My chest tightened as I scrolled. Dad, Caroline, Mom, even the main line from Clark and Company. I did not open anything. Not yet. Just for a moment, I watched the list of calls, all from the last 24 hours, stack up, one after another, until it felt like staring at a wall of accusations. My name in their mouths had been jealous, trouble, embarrassment. I had no reason to believe the messages were anything different now. My thumb hovered over the first voicemail. I imagined Dad's voice, clipped and cold, demanding that I fix what I had broken. I pictured Caroline calling me names that would echo in my head for days. I set the phone back on the table, face down. Not today. I walked out to the balcony railing and looked toward the ocean. The waves rose and fell in the distance, unconcerned. A soft breeze brushed against my arms. Somewhere below, someone laughed. Behind me, on the table, the phone buzzed again, as if the past was reaching out a hand to drag me back in. I reached instead for my coffee, took a slow, steady sip, and made a different choice. I pressed and held the side button until the screen went dark and the buzzing stopped, leaving only the sound of the island and my own breathing filling the quiet. For the first time in a long time, the silence in my life was my choice, not a punishment, not a cold shoulder from someone I loved. Just a simple dark screen on a phone, and the sound of waves instead of ringtones. That morning on Maui, after I shut the phone off, I stood there on the little balcony for a long time, watching the palm fronds sway and the strip of blue water between the rooftops sparkle in the sun. The air was warm on my bare arms. Somewhere below, a truck door slammed, and a radio played an old song I half remembered from high school. It felt like another life. I made myself breakfast on the tiny stove, eggs in a skillet that wobbled slightly on the burner, toast that came out a little too dark. I ate at the table with the balcony door open and the fan turning lazily overhead. Then I opened my laptop and slipped into work mode, because that had always been the place where I knew who I was. Nora and I had agreed on a schedule. She would handle anything that required physical presence in Washington, Oregon. I would review footage, dig through records, and build timelines from my little table in Kihei. For a few hours, nothing existed but the cases. A warehouse manager who thought an employee was skimming inventory. A retired teacher worried that a charming new friend might be a scammer. A woman who wanted to know if the man she met online was really flying to see her, or just stringing her along. It felt good to focus on other people's puzzles instead of my own. I had no idea that while I sat there, tapping notes into a document, back in Seattle, an entirely different kind of investigation was unfolding, with my family's name all over it. I would not learn the details until much later. At the time, all I knew was the soft hum of my laptop and the smell of coffee cooling in my case mug. But afterward, when my brother finally told me what happened, I could almost lay my own day like a translucent sheet over theirs and see where the moments lined up. While I was walking down to the beach in flip-flops and a borrowed sun hat, that afternoon, an email from an investor named Greg landed in my dad's inbox in Tacoma with the force of a small bomb. Greg had been circling Clark and Company for nearly a year, flirting with the idea of putting serious money behind their expansion. He loved Carolyn's design eye, loved the polished narrative of the family business, loved the branding around her and Ethan as a visionary couple guiding them, company into a glittering future. They had courted him carefully. Dinners, presentations, glossy decks with photographs of holiday installations in corporate lobbies that looked like something out of a magazine. But investors do not just listen to stories. they verify. According to my brother, Greg's email that day was not angry. Not yet. I was careful, curious. The subject line referenced a routine compliance review. The body of the message attached several documents and a list of questions that made my dad's stomach drop. Greg's team had been doing due diligence on the people whose faces were at the front of the company's brand. That meant not just Caroline, whose credentials were solid and easy to check, but also Ethan, the man who had started calling himself a senior consultant for Clark & Company in pitch meetings and on his own profile. The documentation did not match what Greg had been told. There were emails Ethan had sent from an address that mimicked the company style, presenting himself as a key member of the leadership team and mentioning responsibilities he had never formally been given. There were project outlines he had shared with other potential partners that implied he controlled budgets and staffing, when in reality, he had no such authority. There were red flags around some of the companies he claimed to have managed projects for. Names that did not appear in legitimate industry lists, addresses that led to empty office parks or shared co-working spaces without signage. Greg wanted to know, in calm professional language, whether Clark & Company could confirm Ethan's titles and responsibilities as well, presented. He asked for clarity on who exactly had authority to negotiate on the company's behalf. He used phrases like material misrepresentation and exposure to risk. He wrote that, depending on their explanation, he might have to reconsider the terms of any future agreement. For my dad, sitting in his office with those words glowing on his screen, it must have felt like the floor tilting. His first reaction, my brother said, was not to look inward. It was to look for an enemy, someone who had pointed the investor in this direction, someone who had whispered in the wrong ear about Ethan. His mind went straight to me. From where he sat, it made a cruel kind of sense. I was the one who had voiced concerns about Ethan, the one who had always been suspicious of trade, the one who had warned Caroline and been slapped down for it. If anyone was going to dig and send something to an outsider, in his mind, it would be me. He called Caroline into his office, shut the door, and forwarded Greg's email to her. As she read, her face went from confusion to anger, to something close to panic. She remembered my message with those links and screenshots, and remembered calling me jealous. She felt the humiliation of seeing her engagement tied up in an investor's questions. She did exactly what I would expect of her in that state. She told Dad she was certain I had done this. It did not matter that Greg's email came from his own research. It did not matter that investors have entire teams for this very purpose. To them, in that moment, it felt personal. Family. Betrayal. While I was walking along the shoreline on Maui, letting the warm water lap at my ankles, they were pacing the length of the office, voices low and tense, convinced that I had somehow slipped past them and stabbed them in the back. Mom joined them later, my brother hovering near the doorway, not quite inside the conversation, but unable to stay fully outside of it either. Mom wrung her hands and said that she could not believe I would do something so hurtful, but there was doubt in her voice because she did not know what to think anymore. Dad replayed the last call he had with me in his head, the way I had refused to apologize, the fact that I had left town without a word. He saw that as further proof. In his mind, I had fled because I was guilty. They did not stop to ask whether an investor of Greg's size would even need a tip from a private investigator in Tacoma to start asking basic questions. By late afternoon, the quiet panic in that conference room had hardened into anger. They started calling me. Dad tried first, punching my number in with more force than necessary, walking the halls with the phone at his ear, listening to it ring and roll to voicemail. He left a message, voice cold and clipped, saying that if I had anything to do with what was happening, I needed to call him immediately. Then another, angrier, saying I had no idea what I had done. Caroline called next, fingers trembling around her phone. Her messages swung between shouting and sobbing. She told me, into the void of my inbox, that I had ruined everything, that clients were going to hear, that their reputation was on the line. She said she could not believe her own sister would be so vindictive. Mom called too, her voice tight with fear. She begged me to think about the family, about the employees who depended on the company, about how hard Dad had worked. She said whatever resentment I held should not be taken out on their livelihood. They texted as well, long messages that tangled accusation and pleading together in a way that would have torn my chest open if I had seen them in real time. But I did not. While those calls stacked up in my voicemail, I was sitting at a small plastic table at a beachside food stand, eating grilled fish out of a paper basket, watching the sun sink into the water in a blaze of color. The air smelled of smoke and salt. Someone's dog chased waves, barking with pure joy. I laughed with the woman at the next table when a chicken strutted by like it owned the place. I felt almost normal for a few hours. I walked back to the studio under a sky crowded with stars, the air soft against my skin, my hair curling in the moisture. I showered, washed sand from my ankles, put on an old cotton sleep shirt, and crawled into bed. The ceiling fan turned in slow, lazy circles. I fell asleep quickly and did not dream. Back in Washington, the night stretched long and sleepless for my family. Dad and Caroline drafted and redrafted a response to Greg, trying to answer his questions without admitting too much. No, even as they typed, that the words sounded weak. Mom sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea she never drank, staring at her phone, willing it to light up with a message from me that would make sense of all this. My brother, who had never fully bought the idea that I would sell them out, watched the whole thing unfold with a knot in his stomach. Later, he told me he had thought about calling Nora to see if she knew where I was, but stopped himself. He said it felt wrong to drag my work world into the middle of the family. Storm. By the time the winter sun edged over the horizon in Tacoma, their fear had curdled into something sour and sharp. They had convinced themselves I was at the center of it. They had used my name in that office more times than I could have counted. On Maui, that same morning, light slipped in around the edges of my curtains and warmed my feet at the end of the bed. I woke slowly, stretched, and listened to birds chattering in a language that was not mine, but was starting to feel familiar. I had no idea that my phone, still dark and silent on the table by the balcony, already held the first pieces of a story that would change how I saw my family forever. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was sunlight spilling across the wall in soft gold. For a moment, I lay there listening to the fan blades turning and the distant crush of waves. My body felt lighter than it had in months. I stretched, rolled onto my side, and reached for my phone without really thinking. I only wanted to check the time. The screen lit up, and the world I had escaped came roaring back in a single line of text. 69 missed calls. My breath caught. For a second, I thought the number had to be a glitch, some kind of malfunction after the flight, but then I tapped the icon and saw the list. Dad, Caroline, Mom, Dad again. Unknown numbers from Tacoma. A few from the office landline. Even one from my brother, which he almost never used unless something was truly wrong. My heart thumped in my ears. I sat up too fast and the room tilted for a second. I pressed a hand to my forehead, trying to slow my breathing. I had turned my phone off the entire day before. None of these calls had come through. Whatever had happened back home had been unfolding while I was sleeping, or tasting grilled fish under a sunset, or letting warm waves wash over my feet. I opened the first voicemail, the most recent. It was Dad. His voice was raw, frayed around the edges in a way I had not heard since I was a kid, and he had. Lost a major client. He told me to call him immediately. He said things were falling apart. He said he needed answers. I closed it and opened the next one from him. His tone was harder in that one, angrier. He accused me outright of sabotaging the company. He said an investor had pulled back from negotiations because of information I had apparently provided. His words came out in clipped bursts like he was pacing while he spoke. A sick feeling rose in my stomach. I skipped ahead to Caroline's messages. Her voice was uneven, swinging from fury to panic. She said Ethan was being questioned by people with badges and clipboards, that Greg's team was demanding documents and explanations, that clients had started whispering. She said I had no idea what I had done, that she hoped I was satisfied. Another message from her was barely more than a sob. She said that if their holiday reception fell apart, the entire expansion would crumble with it. I set the phone on the bedspread, my hand trembling. The room felt too quiet, too gentle. The waves outside were too steady compared to the storm in my ear. I stood and walked to the balcony, pushing the door open to let the breeze hit my face. I gripped the railing and stared at the street below. A couple carrying surfboards walked past, laughing, as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. I watched them go until they turned a corner. My phone buzzed again. A text. It was from my brother, the only person in the family who ever tried to meet me halfway. His message was shorter than usual. He told me things had gotten bad. He said people at the office were confused and that someone had shown up, earlier asking about Ethan's credentials. He wrote that Dad and Caroline were convinced I had tipped the investor off. Then he said something that made my throat close. He said he did not believe it, but I needed to call someone before it got worse. I stood there, barefoot, heart pounding, the warm air brushing my arms. It felt like my body existed in two places at once, one here, in the calm of Maui, and one back in Washington where everything was unraveling. I dialed Nora, needing someone who would speak to me like I was still anchored to the earth. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright with morning energy. I told her about the messages, about the missed calls, about the accusations. She let out a low whistle. She said the office up north had been buzzing, that a few clients had reached out to her asking questions she could not answer. I asked her if she had heard anything else. She hesitated, then said she had gotten a strange message the night before from a colleague in Bellevue, who sometimes contracted work out to Ethan. He had been flagged by someone doing professional checks. He said words like inconsistency and liability. Nora said she thought it was just industry gossip until now. I leaned against the railing, pinching the bridge of my nose. She asked if I had actually contacted anyone about Ethan. I said no. She said she knew that, but my family might not. People panic when they feel cornered. I nodded, even though she could not see me. The truth was, my family had not trusted my intentions for a long time. Not when it came to Caroline. Not when it came to the company. Not when it came to anything that did not fit their picture of me. When I hung up with Nora, I sat at the small table inside and opened my laptop. I pulled up the folder I had made with all the screenshots of Ethan's inconsistencies. I had saved them because I wanted Caroline to know I was acting out of care, not out of spite. But seeing them now, laid out neatly in rows, I felt a chill. If an investor had found gaps, if someone had been digging around, it made sense they would stumble upon the same inconsistencies I had noticed. They would have found them without my help. It did not matter, though. My family believed what they believed. I stood up and paced the tile floor, my fingers pressed to my temples. The hurt settled in slowly, like tide water rising inch by inch. I had warned them because I cared. They had turned that care into a weapon, pointed back at me. A soft knock sounded on the door. I froze for a moment, then realized it must be the owner of the rental unit dropping off fresh towels. I opened the door to find a stack of them on the mat and no one in sight, just the ocean smell drifting in. I carried the towels inside and set them on the bed. My phone buzzed again, another voicemail notification. My chest tightened. I could not bring myself to listen to another round of accusations. Not yet. Instead, I grabbed my keys and walked outside. The sky was clear and bright, the kind of day that begged you to forget everything except sunshine. I made it halfway down the block before I stopped, hands on my knees, breathing through the knot in my chest. Then, slowly, I stood up and kept walking. I headed toward the shoreline again, letting the rhythm of my steps steady me. I did not know yet that the storm back home was about to hit a new peak. I did not know that while I tried to catch my breath under a Hawaiian sun, my family was walking straight into a truth that would crack everything open. And I had no idea that when they finally reached me, their voices would sound very different than they had the day before. I kept walking until the little street ended and the sand began, a pale strip stretching toward the water. The sun was high and bright, the sky that unbelievable blue that makes you feel like maybe the world is not such a bad place after all. My feet sank slightly with each step, grains of sand warm between my toes. Waves rolled in and slid back with a soft hiss, leaving behind glistening foam. I stood at the edge of the water and let it wash over my ankles. The coolness made me shiver in spite of the heat. I stared out at the horizon and tried to let the endlessness of it calm me. Somewhere, back on the mainland, my family was caught in a storm I had not created. Here, the ocean just breathed in and out, indifferent to all of it. For a while, I succeeded in not thinking at all. I watched a little boy chase a flock of birds, his laughter high and wild. I watched an older couple walk along the shoreline, their hands brushing now and then, their conversation easy. I listened to the low murmur of people talking under umbrellas behind me. Life went on, one small moment at a time. Eventually, though, the thoughts slipped back in. Dad's voice in that voicemail, rough and accusing. Caroline's frantic tone. My brother's short, worried text. The words sabotage and ruined everything echoed in my mind like a bad song I could not turn off. I knew how this looked to them. I had raised concerns about Ethan. I had dug into his background. I had fled town right when things started to crack. To people who already saw me as suspicious and difficult, it must have seemed like a pattern. Not a coincidence. I hugged my arms around myself, even as the sun warmed my shoulders. For a second, I wanted to rewind everything, to erase the phone call to my sister, to unsee the parking lot, to unlearn the habits that made me look twice at what others were happy to accept. Then I took a breath and straightened. I had told the truth. Whatever had come after that, I had not orchestrated. I was not going to apologize for seeing what was there. When the heat finally felt like too much, I walked back toward the road and returned to the studio. I rinsed sand from my feet in the tiny shower, changed into dry clothes, and made iced tea in a glass that sweated on the counter. My phone lay on the table where I had left it, face down again, like a sleeping thing. I did not quite dare to wake. I sat for a long time just looking at it. Then I turned my laptop on instead. The familiar glow of the screen steadied me. I checked on case files, updated a report, sent Nora a few notes on a client we were both worried about. Mundane, ordinary tasks that had nothing to do with investors or expansions or men who pretended to be more than they were. Time passed. The light outside shifted from harsh white to softer gold. The room grew warmer, then cooled as a breeze picked up. The ceiling fan clicked in a gentle, comforting rhythm. It was late afternoon when my laptop chimed with an incoming call. It was Nora, I answered, and her face appeared on the screen, framed by the clutter of our shared office back in Tacoma. Her hair was pulled up, a pen stuck through the bun. She looked tired. She asked first if I was all right. I said I was, more or less. She hesitated, then said there was something I needed to hear, something that might make everything hurt a little more and a little less at the same time. She told me that my dad's investor, Greg, had sent a second email that morning. His team had kept digging. They had pulled email headers, looked at domains, traced who owned what. It turned out that Ethan had created an address that mimicked the company. Format almost exactly, just different enough that a careful eye could see it was not official. He had used that address to contact potential partners. He signed his messages with a title he had never been given, called himself part of the executive team, and talked about budgets and decisions he did not control. In some of those letters, he even attached slides with the Clark & Company logo that he had designed, himself, without approval. I listened, stomach clenched. Nora said that Greg's lawyers had called the main office directly. They asked to speak with whoever handled legal and compliance. They laid out, in calm, measured voices, all the ways Ethan had misrepresented himself. They wanted to know how much of it the company had known about, and whether they had sanctioned his behavior. They used words like exposure and fiduciary duty and potential fraud. My head spun a little. Then, Nora told me the part that made everything inside me shift. Greg's team had mentioned, almost in passing, that they had received no outside tip. They said their concerns came entirely from internal review and standard background checks. When my dad, grasping at whatever story had kept him upright until that moment, implied that perhaps someone with a personal grudge had stirred the pot. The attorney on the other end of the line had shut that down quickly. They said they did not base investment decisions on family gossip. They based them on verifiable facts. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. It came out shaky. So it was never me, I said. Nora looked at me through the screen, her eyes soft. "It was never you," she said. "They know that now." According to her, after that call, the mood in the office had changed. Not calmer. The crisis was still very real, but the direction of the anger shifted. Instead of my name, other words filled the air. Ethan. Responsibility. How did we miss this? Caroline had locked herself in her office for a while. When she emerged, her face was blotchy, her hair pulled back in a way that exposed how much she had been crying. She had asked their finance manager to pull every record of expense reports, with Ethan's name on them. She had told a receptionist to draft a statement for staff, something about ongoing review and appreciation for their work in a challenging time. She had not mentioned me. Nora said that at some point, God had gone into the small conference room with my brother and closed the door. Voices carried down the hall, even with it shut. People heard Dad say my name, then heard him say the words wrong and misjudged and did not listen. That part made my throat ache. Nora said she had not stayed to eavesdrop. She had her own work to do. But the feeling in the office when the door finally opened was different. Less like a witch hunt. More like the heavy quiet after a bad storm, when people are still counting damage. By the time she finished telling me all of this, my tea had grown warm and flat on the table. I wrapped my hands around the glass anyway, needing something to hold. "They still might blame me," I said, more out of habit than belief. She shook her head. "Not for this. Not anymore. They may not know how to say it yet, but they know you did not start this." We were silent for a moment. Then she added, gently, that Ethan had stopped answering calls entirely, that his social media accounts had gone dark, that people in the industry were already saying his name with that mix of pity and anger reserved for those who burn bridges they never really owned. We talked a little longer about work. When we hung up, the room felt both larger and smaller at once. I stood up, walked to the balcony, and leaned my forehead against the cool metal of the railing. The sky over Maui was streaked with thin clouds, the sun sliding toward the water. Somewhere a dog barked. A child laughed. The world here did not tilt with the news that my family had finally seen the truth for what it was. Inside me, though, something realigned. For days I had been living like an accused person, even if no one had managed to say the words to my face. Now, suddenly, the charge had been dropped. Not because I had defended myself eloquently, or begged, or produced an alibi, but because reality had simply insisted on being seen. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt old, bone-deep tired from carrying the weight of everyone else's refusal to look. Back at the table, my phone lay where I had left it. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. My thumb hovered over the power button. If I turned it on, there would be more messages, more calls. Some might still be angry echoes of the story they had told themselves before Greg's attorney used cool, precise words to slice through it. Some might be different. For the first time since I had landed on Maui, I did not feel afraid of hearing them. I pressed the button. The screen flickered to life, the familiar logo blooming and then giving way to my home screen. Notifications poured in again. Missed calls from earlier in the day. Voicemails, texts. The phone vibrated so steadily it felt like a living thing in my palm. I watched the numbers climb for a minute, then set it gently on the table and let it finish its noisy panic. When the buzzing finally stopped, a new call came in almost immediately. My brother. I stared at his name glowing on the screen, the little picture we had never bothered to change from the one of him holding a fishing pole years ago at a lake in Oregon. My chest tightened, but not with dread this time. I picked it up. His voice was tired, but there was no accusation in it, just relief and something like shame. He told me things had gotten worse at the office, that clients were nervous, that Dad looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. He also told me that Greg's team had made it abundantly clear the mess with Ethan was his own making. He said Dad knew now that I had not been the one to tip anyone off. For a long second, neither of us spoke. Then he said that Dad had been trying to reach me all day. I looked out toward the darkening sky, feeling the island breeze on my face, the phone warm against my ear. I asked him quietly what Dad wanted from me now. There was a pause, and in that small silence, I knew that whatever came next would change more than just the future of A Company. He hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me more than any words could. I leaned back in the chair, the balcony door letting in a cool thread of evening air, and waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, careful, as if he knew the slightest wrong inflection might shatter something fragile. He said Dad wanted to talk, not yell, not accused. He wanted to explain what had happened. He wanted, in his own way, to make things right. But my brother added, almost apologetically, that Dad also hoped I might help, not with the lies or the damage already uncovered, but with the fallout. There were questions from clients. People wanted clarity. Investors wanted proof of internal controls. The company had to rebuild trust, fast. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that sink in. Even after everything, even after accusing me, doubting me, banning me from Christmas, they were turning back to me because they knew I was the one who could handle the crisis. The one who saw details they overlooked. The one who didn't break under pressure. My brother kept talking. He said that by mid-afternoon, the office had felt like someone dropped a bomb in the lobby. People were shaking their heads in disbelief at the documents Ethan had forged. Caroline had stopped defending him entirely once she saw an email he had sent to another firm, referring to himself as the lead architect of a project she had spent 3 years building. My brother said she went pale and had to sit down. The humiliation must have been unbearable. When Dad learned from Greg's attorney that no relative had tipped them off, that all of the red flags came from standard diligence, something in him cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like ice under a steady weight. My brother said Dad had whispered that he had misjudged me, that he hadn't listened, that he didn't want to believe anything bad about the man Caroline loved, so he made me the problem instead. I swallowed hard. Hearing it secondhand didn't soften the blow. If anything, it made it sharper. My brother waited, maybe expecting me to respond, but I couldn't find words. Not yet. He finally asked if I was safe, if I was okay being alone out in Maui. I told him I was fine, that I had been working, walking by the water, sleeping better than I had in months. He said he was glad that maybe distance was what I needed. We talked for a few more minutes. Nothing heavy. He told me about a neighbor's dog who kept sneaking into their yard. I told him about a gecko that lived behind my balcony light. Then he paused and said he had to go because Dad was looking for him. Before hanging up, he said something simple that made my chest tighten. He said he hoped I wouldn't hold the past few days against him, that he had never believed I would do anything to hurt the family, that he was proud of me, even if the others didn't say it. The call ended. The apartment felt too still again. I set the phone down on the table and walked back to the balcony. Night had slipped almost fully into place. The street lights glowed softly. Someone a few doors down was cooking something that smelled like ginger and garlic, the scent drifting through the warm air. I wrapped my arms around myself and leaned on the railing. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, heavy and slow. Everything my brother had said ran through my mind in loops. The investor, the documents, the panic, the anger, the realization that I had been innocent all along, and underneath it all, the truth I had been trying not to look directly at. They needed something from me. Of course they did. They always had. And they had always believed they were entitled to it. I stayed on the balcony until the breeze cooled the sweat on my face. Then I went inside, dimmed the overhead light, and opened my laptop again. Not for work. Not at first. I pulled up the same folder of screenshots, those early bits of evidence I had collected, the ones my family had once dismissed as jealousy. I looked at each one, not with anger this time, but with clarity. I saw the way Ethan had written his title differently on different platforms. I saw the mismatched dates, the fake logos, the half-built website with stock photos. I saw how obvious it was once someone stopped believing what they wanted to believe. My cursor hovered over the folder for a long moment. Then I closed the laptop. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning in its slow circle. I thought about Caroline crying in her office. I thought about Dad pacing, talking too fast, asking for me. I thought about Mom sitting silently with a mug in her hands she never drank. Part of me felt a deep ache for all the years they had never truly seen me. Another part felt stronger than it had in a long time. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke again, the room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight through the curtains. My mouth felt dry. My heart thudded at a steady beat that told me I had been dreaming something unsettling. I sat up, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and reached for my phone. A new text had arrived while I slept. It was from Dad. Just 3 words. "We need you." I stared at it for a long time, the glow lighting my face in the dark. Outside, a car rolled down the street, its headlights sliding across the balcony railing like a slow spotlight. I set the phone down without replying. Then I lay back on the pillow, eyes open, pulse steady, working that morning would bring a choice I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. And for the first time, I did not feel scared of choosing myself instead. I woke just before sunrise, my body still tuned to Seattle time. The room was dim, the curtains a pale gray against the soft morning light. For a moment, I lay there listening to the ceiling fan and the distant hush of the ocean, feeling strangely calm. Then I remembered the last text from my dad, those 3 words my brother had warned me about. "We need you." The piece cracked. I sat up slowly, my feet finding the cool tile, and reached for my phone on the little table by the balcony door. My thumb hovered over the button. Part of me wanted to slide it into a drawer and walk away. Another part knew I could not live in that suspended place forever. I pressed and held. The screen lit up. The logo flashed, and then the notifications started pouring in, like hail on a metal roof. Vibrations stacked on top of one another, the phone jittering in my hand. I watched the little numbers climb. Missed calls, voicemails, text messages, group chats. When the buzzing finally slowed, I opened the call log. There it was, 69 missed calls. For a long second, all I could do was stare. The list blurred in front of my eyes. Dad, Caroline, Mom. The main line from Clark & Company. My brother. A few numbers I did not recognize, but knew belonged to people in their orbit. Every few minutes, it seemed, someone had reached across 3,000 miles to try to pull me back. My heartbeat picked up, hard and steady. I swallowed and clicked into the voicemails. The oldest one from my dad was still edged with anger. He told me that an investor had pulled hard on loose threads and that he knew I had something to do with it. His words were clipped, almost breathless. He sounded less like a father and more like a man watching his foundation crack. The next message from him came later that same day. His tone was sharper, almost accusing. He said that the company was suffering, that my timing in leaving had been suspicious, that if this was some twisted attempt at revenge for being asked to apologize, I had gone too far. I felt my jaw clench as I listened, that old familiar mix of hurt and fury rising in my chest. Then I played the first voicemail from Caroline. Her voice came through jagged and too loud, like she was pacing while talking. She said everything was falling apart, that Ethan was under scrutiny, that Greg and his team were questioning every project his name had touched. She said the holiday reception might be canceled. That staff was whispering in corners. She used words like ruined and betrayed, and said my name like it tasted bitter. I let that one finish and then deleted it without listening again. The next message from her was different. There was a hitch in her breathing at the start. She tried to sound composed, but I could hear the tears under it. She said she did not understand why I hated her so much. She said I had always resented her, and now I had the satisfaction of watching her life crumble. I closed my eyes, thumb hovering over the delete button, then pressed it. Mom's messages were softer but no less painful. In the first one, she pleaded with me to think about the workers who might lose their jobs, about the years your dad has poured into this business. She said she was sure we could talk it out if I would just call. She never once asked whether I had actually done what they thought I had done. The assumption of my guilt was woven right into every word. I listened to 2 more from her, each more frantic than the last, then stopped. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a band around it and was slowly tightening it with. Each voice I heard I scrolled forward to the more recent voicemails, the ones that came in after the conversation with Greg's attorneys, after the realization that the investor had not been tipped off by anyone in the family. The tone had shifted. Dad sounded older. The anger was mostly gone, smoothed over by something quieter and heavier. He said they had learned more about Ethan's lies. He said they had been wrong about where the trouble started. He said my name more gently, like it might break if he was not careful. He did not quite apologize in that first, softer message, but the edge was gone. There was another voicemail from him later, one that made my throat ache. His voice cracked once, something I had rarely heard in my life. He said he knew now that I had only been trying to protect my sister. He said he was sorry for doubting me, sorry for the things he had said, sorry for telling me I was not welcome at Christmas. I replayed that one twice, not because I enjoyed hearing him small, but because a part of me that had been 10 years old for far too long needed to know I had not imagined the words. Caroline's newer messages came next. The first was just a choked breath and the sound of her trying to pull herself together. She said she had seen the emails Ethan had sent pretending to be in charge of projects she had led. She said she had watched one of their longtime clients look at her with pity. She said she did not know who she was without the story she had built around them. Then, very quietly, she said she was starting to think I had been the only one willing to tell her the truth. I did not delete that one. Not yet. My brother's voicemail was simple. He said he was worried. He said things were a mess. He said Dad was trying to find a way to reach me that did not sound like a command. He said he hoped I would pick up at some point, not for their sake, but for my own. So I did not carry this alone. By the time I finished listening to the last of the voicemails, my coffee had gone cold on the table. I had not even realized I had poured a cup. The text messages were another tidal wave. There were older ones filled with blame, lines of words that accused me of betrayal, selfishness, cruelty. There were newer ones layered on top, crowded apologies bumping up against those same accusations, like no one had bothered to erase the earlier story before trying to write a new one. Mom sent messages about not sleeping, about Dad's blood pressure, about her fear that the company they had built would not survive the hit. She called me her thoughtful girl again in one of them, a name I had not heard since grade school, as if that might tug me closer. David's texts were more formal. He wrote that there had been a serious misunderstanding, that he had misjudged my actions, that he wanted to talk when I was ready. He also wrote that the company was on the brink of losing a contract worth more money than they had ever risked on a single project, and that any insight I had as an investigator might help them navigate next steps. There it was, the need, wrapped now in softer words but still sharp. Caroline's messages were the hardest to read. In them, her bravado fell away. She wrote that she was ashamed, that she had ignored every red flag because she liked how it felt to be admired next to a handsome man with a smooth story. She said she had defended Ethan to everyone, even against the evidence in front of her, and now she was paying the price for that pride. At the end of one long message, she wrote that she did not expect me to forgive her, but she was asking anyway. I set the phone down and pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until I saw little bursts of color. Tears slid out anyway. Not loud, ugly sobs, just a quiet, steady leak that had been waiting behind my ribs for days. I had spent so long being the one no one believed that finally being vindicated felt strange, almost hollow. There was no triumph, only exhaustion. I stood, walked to the tiny sink, and splashed cool water on my face. When I looked up into the little mirror, the woman staring back at me did not look like a daughter who had brought a company to its knees. She looked like someone who had simply told the truth and then been crushed under the weight of everyone else's refusal to carry it. I was drying my face on a thin towel when my phone buzzed again on the table. An unknown number. For a second, I almost let it go to voicemail with all the others. Something nudged me to answer. I picked up and said hello, my voice rough. The man on the other end introduced himself as Greg. His voice was calm, measured, the way people sound when they have spent a lot of time on conference calls and in boardrooms. He said he hoped I did not mind his reaching out directly. He had gotten my number from the company as part of this unfortunate mess, and he thought it was only fair that he speak with me for a moment. My shoulders tensed. I asked what he wanted. He said he had heard, indirectly, that there had been a belief in the family that I might have been the source of the information that triggered his review. He said he wanted to be absolutely clear that was not the case. His team had found everything through their own process: background checks, document comparisons, standard protocol. He said something else, too. He said that, in his experience, it was often the person who raised the first uncomfortable question who ended up wearing the blame when the truth finally surfaced. He thought that was unfair. He did not know me. He did not pretend to understand my family, but he did not want his investigation to be used as a weapon against me. I felt my throat tighten again, for a different reason this time. I thanked him, my voice soft. He said he hoped, whatever happened with the company, that I would not let this experience convince me to stop asking hard questions. Then he wished me well and ended the call. I sat there for a long beat, phone still in my hand, listening to the dial tone fade into silence. Outside, the light had shifted. The sun was higher now, the sky a clear expanse of blue. The normal sounds of the street floated in through the balcony door. A scooter passing by. Someone is laughing. A radio playing a song from another decade. My phone buzzed once more. This time it was not an unknown number. Dad's name filled the screen, the little photo of him in front of the company sign beside it. The device vibrated steadily in my palm, as if it were asking a question I had spent my entire life preparing to answer. I watched it ring, feeling the weight of all the years behind us and all the possible futures ahead, and drew in a slow, careful breath, not yet sure what I was about to do. David's name kept glowing on the screen while the phone vibrated against my palm. It felt like the entire room leaned toward that tiny rectangle of light, waiting to see what I would choose. I let it ring until the sound cut off on its own. The silence that followed was thick, almost humming. A few seconds later, a text appeared. "Please, just call me." I stared at the message. My chest felt tight and strangely hollow at the same time. The part of me that had spent decades chasing scraps of approval wanted to answer right away. The newer part, the part that had begun waking up the moment I boarded that plane to Maui, held still. I slid the phone onto the table, face down, and walked to the balcony. The morning had sharpened into full daylight. People were out walking to small cafes, carrying takeout cups, wearing sun hats. Somewhere, a truck rumbled over uneven pavement. I leaned my elbows on the rail and breathed in the warm, salty air. For the first time in a long while, the world felt bigger than the narrow lane my family had kept me in. I stayed outside until the heat pushed me back indoors. When I re-entered the room, my phone vibrated again. A voicemail this time. I didn't listen. I stepped into the little kitchenette and began making eggs, something I rarely bothered with at home. The normalcy of cracking shells, the sound of the pan heating, the smell of butter softening on metal, brought my nerves down bit by bit. I was halfway through my breakfast when the phone rang again. I sighed, wiped my hands on a towel, and walked over. It was my mom this time. The picture beside her name was one I had taken years ago during Thanksgiving, back when Caroline and I both still lived under their roof. My mom had flour on her sweater and was laughing at something off camera. The image felt like it belonged to another lifetime. I let the call go to voicemail. A minute later, she sent a text. "Sweetheart, please call your dad. We are all so worried." I set the phone down again, this time more firmly. I could feel the pressure rising from 3,000 miles away. Even their apologies still came wrapped in expectations. I decided to go for a walk. I took the winding sidewalk toward the little shops along the main road. The sun had climbed higher, but the breeze kept the heat from pressing too hard. I passed a small bakery and bought an iced tea, then wandered past a row of tourist stands with handmade jewelry. A woman in her 60s smiled at me as she adjusted a display of bracelets. She asked where I was visiting from. For a moment, I almost said something like, Earth, just because it felt true. Instead, I said, Seattle. She told me welcome, in a warm voice that held no expectations at all. I kept walking. The tension in my shoulders eased with every block I put between myself and the vibrating phone in my room. I found a shaded bench near a cluster of palms and sat, sipping the tea slowly. I watched cars drift past and people carrying beach bags. Everything around me moved at a pace that made room for breathing. I took out my phone, not to call anyone, but to pull up a note I had written after arriving. It was a list of small things I wanted to reclaim. Waking up without dread. Eating when hungry instead of when it was convenient for others. Trusting my instincts, even when no one else did. Not shrinking to fit someone else's story. I read the list twice. A sense of steadiness settled in my chest. I was sliding the phone back into my bag when it buzzed again. This time it was a text from my brother. They found Ethan. My heart kicked hard. I sat up straighter on the bench. A second text came through before I could type anything. He left the city. Greg's team tracked him through some financial filings. He's been using different names. This is going to be worse than we thought. I felt the air around me shift, like the universe had just taken a deep inhale. I typed, "Is everyone safe?" My brother replied almost immediately. "Yes, but the office is in chaos. Dad is trying to get ahead of it. Caroline is devastated. They want to talk to you. They want your help." I stared at the message. That familiar mix of resentment and longing washed through me. I typed again. Do they think I told Greg? Do they still think that? A long pause, then, no, not anymore. They know you didn't. They know this is all him. Him, Ethan, a man I had known only through glimpses and instincts, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. A man who had built his identity out of stolen scraps and false layers. I sat there for a few minutes, letting everything settle. Tourists drifted past, carrying plastic bags of souvenirs. A bird hopped near my shoe. The world moved on, unaware that my past life was folding in on itself miles away. Eventually, I stood and began walking back to the apartment. My mind was quiet, but not empty. I was weighing something heavy and delicate at the same time. I reached my door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The room was still, but the phone on the table had lit up with yet another message. I could see Dad's name glowing through the screen. For the first time, I didn't feel pulled by it. I felt anchored in myself. Still, I picked up the phone and opened the newest text. It read, "Please, we cannot fix this without you." My throat tightened. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the message. Part of me wanted to burst out laughing, because wasn't that the story of my life? They only reached for me when they were drowning, never when the water was calm. But another part of me felt an ache, deep and old. The ache of someone who had spent years hoping to be valued for more than what she could solve. I stood and walked out onto the balcony. The breeze ruffled my hair and carried the scent of the ocean. I leaned on the rail, my phone warm in my hand, and looked out at the waves breaking on the shore. For a moment, I imagined dialing Dad. I imagined his voice, the mix of fear and pride he was too proud to name. I imagined Caroline crying, trying to explain herself. I imagined my mom's soft voice calling me her thoughtful girl again. I imagined stepping back into that whirlwind. Then I imagined staying right here, breathing, working the job I had chosen, living my own life, being believed not because anyone else said so, but because I finally believed myself. My phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't check it. I stayed there in the warm Maui air, watching the horizon, feeling something inside me shift into place. And when I finally turned to go back inside, I knew the next message I read would change something in a way none of them expected. I stepped back inside and closed the balcony door behind me, leaving the ocean sounds outside like a gentle curtain. The room felt warm and quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat. I set my phone on the table and stared at it, waiting for the next vibration. But it stayed still this time, almost as if it knew I needed a moment without anyone reaching for me. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let my hands rest loosely in my lap. I felt the faint exhaustion of the past few days in my limbs, but there was a steadiness beneath it, a grounded feeling I had never been able to access back home. I let that grow inside my chest for a few breaths before I finally picked up the phone again. There was another message waiting, this one from my brother. "Call me when you're ready. No pressure, just me." That, more than any of the frantic pleas, made something in my chest soften. I dialed him right away. He answered on the second ring and asked if I was all right. I told him I was. He asked if he could say something without me hanging up. I said yes. He said he was proud of me for leaving. He said he wished he had done something similar when he was younger. He said he loved our family, but he saw now how much of the weight had always fallen onto me. He said he knew Dad was wrong. He said he told him so. My eyes stung. I leaned back on the pillows and listened to him breathe on the other end. Then he said that Dad and Caroline were still hoping I would help. But he also said no one had a right to demand that from me. He said the truth had come out because it always does, and that maybe this was my chance to step out of the shadow I never should have been standing in. I thanked him quietly. He asked what I planned to do. I looked around the little room. The small table with the shell-shaped coaster, the open suitcase at the foot of the bed, the window framing the curve of the palms outside. I told him I was going to stay for a while. He didn't argue. He didn't tell me I owed anyone anything. He only said he understood. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet. The sunlight had shifted across the bedspread by the time I finally stood to stretch. I changed into light clothes and went for a walk along the road leading toward the beach. The sun was soft by then. The water shimmered in long silver streaks. Children were digging in the sand. A couple walked hand in hand near the tide line. The breeze smelled like salt and hibiscus. As I walked, my mind sifted through the last few weeks, arranging everything in a new order I had never quite allowed before. The truth about Ethan, the lies he built, the harm he caused, the way my family clung to him because he fit a story they liked, the way they turned on me because I didn't fit theirs. And then the moment everything broke open, not through my doing, but through the weight of the truth itself. For years, I had believed that if I explained myself better, if I proved my loyalty more clearly, if I made myself small enough, patient enough, resilient enough, one day they would see me the way I longed to be seen. But standing there on that beach, the wind pulling gently at my hair, I realized something deeper. They hadn't failed to understand me. They simply hadn't tried. And I was finally done auditioning for a place I had already grown past. I walked all the way to the far side of the beach, where the rocks rose in dark shapes against the surf. I sat there for a while, letting the waves drown out the last echoes of guilt I didn't need to carry. When I returned to the apartment, the sun was dipping low. The light turned soft and golden and spilled across the floor. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and found my phone exactly where I left it, silent and still. I picked it up one more time. There were 2 new messages. One from Mom, just asking if I was safe. One from Dad, shorter than all the others. I am sorry. When you are ready, I hope we can talk. The apology was quiet. It was late. It was imperfect. But it was something he had never given me before. I stared at it for a moment, then set the phone down gently on the bed. I walked to the window and slid it open, letting the warm evening air drift in. The world outside was settling into night, soft and peaceful. I let that peace fill the room, then fill me. When I finally sat down to write my notes from the day, something inside me felt solid and steady. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing. And as I closed my notebook, a last thought moved through me. Not angry, not bitter, just clear. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud at all. It's living a life no one thought you were brave enough to claim. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you're listening from.